In his speech to the UN General Assembly on September 23, 2003, Secretary General Kofi Annan stated, "History is a harsh judge. It will not forgive us if we let this moment pass." He proposed that there be a thorough study of ways to strengthen the UN through radical reform of its major organs. The problems with the major organs are that the General Assembly has for many years been engaged in a power struggle between the developing nations, known as the G77 and China, on the one hand, and the major nations of the North, who overwhelmingly pay the costs of the UN and its operations. So far, the General Assembly has not considered any way that seems likely to manage that power struggle constructively. A second problem is that the 1945 design of the Security Council, now 60 years out of date, fails to represent the power realities of the 21st century, and thus prevents the UN from dealing effectively with threats to world peace and other global problems. My name is Mike Kronish, and I invite you to review with me the concept of weighted voting and how weighted voting will safely and fairly give the General Assembly the power it needs to make binding decisions and assume limited legislative powers, and how, with weighted representation in the Security Council, it can be revitalized and democratized. First, a brief message from the retired TV anchorman who still bears the title, the most trusted man in America. Second, let us review how ambassadors for weighted voting are responding to the call from the Secretary General for radical reform of the General Assembly and Security Council at meetings with key UN players at the missions to the UN in New York and at their foreign ministries around the world. Finally, let us consider a short presentation on amending the UN Charter from the Columbia University professor who yearly gives an orientation lecture to the new Security Council members on the history of reform in the UN system. And then, what you and your organization can do now to advance this project in your communities, and later to lobby your senators when the time comes for ratification of relevant UN Charter amendments. Here is the keynote address that Walter Cronkite presented at a conference at Seton Hall University Law School entitled, "What Future for the United Nations?"
Let us understand, I hope without contest, the UN's present situation. It has been brutalized by the leader of a great nation who has suggested that it is irrelevant. Any thoughtful analysis puts that black thought to rest, and certainly there is none who would suggest that the UN is at death's door. None of its obvious problems appear to be life-threatening. The problem is not how to save the United Nations, but how to strengthen the United Nations, the one organization we have, the one true hope we have, of creating a world free of international violence, poverty, starvation, disease, and plague. But much needs to be done to strengthen the organization, or, as the New York Times recently put it, if the United Nations were being created today, what would you want done differently? It was out of the horror and the ashes of World War II that the United Nations was founded, by a global population of presumably civilized humans. In shock over what their governments had done in their name, they had tried after World War I to create an organization that could preserve the peace, and failed. They were determined to do better this time. But as nations came together, they also left large cracks as they compromised the larger nations' determination not to surrender their sovereign power. Our job now is to seal up those cracks, even as we watch the spread around the globe of those terrible weapons that threaten the destruction of all our planet's living things. First efforts in such a huge enterprise as the founding of the United Nations seldom are without fault. After all, much of the strength of our American government is found in the amendments to our Constitution that time and practice dictated. Let us consider some of the limitations that soon appeared in the UN structure. The UN's General Assembly lacks an equitable, weighted voting system, and therefore can make only recommendations, not enforceable law. The Charter provides no independent source of funding that would allow consistent achievement of its mission. The Security Council, while charged with the primary responsibility for peace and security, stands paralyzed in the face of any conflict in which one of its 5 permanent members wields the veto. And despite Charter provisions for an effective UN standing peacekeeping capacity and national standby forces, the UN must still scramble, begging and borrowing, to assemble even the most rudimentary peacekeeping force. And as an example of the seemingly insoluble problems, the UN has no enforcement power to bring to justice nations and leaders who violate its tenets. The UN established the International Criminal Court to prosecute would-be dictators before they start wars or commit crimes against humanity. But the United States has undermined its importance by refusing to participate. A mere recital of the problems highlights the fact that the road ahead certainly is not easy. However, the more difficult the problem, the greater the demand for wisdom and courage as we seek credible solutions. We can consider incremental changes to the UN, or amendments to the Charter, or perhaps even a new UN Charter. We must combine our greatest hopes with prudent political judgment, and then we shall be expanding the margins to encase what is essential of our United Nations, and if it's to live up to our hopes for lasting peace and a prosperous, healthy, just, and free world. In conferences like this, and auxiliary ones along the internet, rests the hope for our planet's future. You all should be proud of your concern and for participating in efforts like this. I take the liberty of speaking for a grateful nation, nay, a grateful world, in thanking you for your interest. Thank you.
The binding triad. And now let us consider the way weighted voting will enable the UN to make better decisions that can be fully implemented, because the votes going into the decisions will represent the real power of the different member countries. And let us also see why weighted voting will safely and fairly empower the General Assembly to provide solutions for global problems and only global problems. What are global problems? Today, peace and pollution are universally recognized as global problems. Some believe that in the near future, poverty may be added to that list. Dick Hudson, founder of the Center for War Peace Studies, designed the binding triad. For a period of 15 or 20 years, board members held meetings with ambassadors and members of mission staffs. The reaction was rarely more than polite. Things began to change during 2003 because of the Secretary General's call for radical change and because several other efforts at fundamental reform were unsuccessful. At a meeting in the spring of 2005 with a legal counselor at the Canadian mission, we were told that the message we had just delivered should be taken to the key foreign ministries. The counselor explained that ambassadors at the UN and their staffs are simply messengers. He urged that the weighted voting concept should be explained at the respective foreign ministries directly to the person making recommendations to the foreign minister on matters of UN reform. That is the task we have been engaged in since early March 2006. The Group of 77 Developing Nations was organized in 1964 to enhance their joint negotiating capacity. The Group of 77, known as the G77, and China now include 132 nations. Careful analysis leads us to conclude that nothing can be accomplished regarding UN reform unless it originates with the G77. This year, South Africa holds the presidency of the G77, and so South Africa was at the top of our list. Here is the message that we are presenting at the UN missions and at the key foreign ministries. we deal with both the binding triad plan, which we think is best for the General Assembly, and the Schwartzberg proposal, which we consider best for the Security Council. The presentation we make is clear and simple. We are here today at your mission, first to explain the concept of weighted voting, and then to ask for your assistance in making an appointment for us at your foreign ministry. Our letter requesting today's meeting listed the topic as additional power for the General Assembly as the world's legislature. It explained that we were writing at the suggestion of Mr. Fadl Nasarodian of the Foreign Ministry in Pretoria, South Africa. It continued, a recent example of the General Assembly crisis took place, you will recall, on April 28, 2006. 108 members of the Group of 77, together with China, voted to table major parts of the Secretary General's blueprint for UN management reform. The U.S. led 50 nations that voted against the tabling motion. The G77 explained that the major reason for its negative vote was the perception that the proposed reforms are part of a larger strategy by the major donor states, primarily the U.S., to assure tighter control of the UN internally. The U.S. responded that absent top-to-bottom management reform, the UN will continue to be ill-equipped to meet the current demands that we, as member states, place upon the organization. We, the ambassadors for weighted voting, see merit in both positions. There is a solution which can satisfy both the G77 and the major donor nations. Since 1945, the General Assembly has been envisioned as the world's legislature, but it still has no authority other than to manage the internal operations of the UN. It has no international power because its voting system does not reflect reality. To become the UN's legislature, the General Assembly must have a system of representation that will not only reflect the sovereign equality of each member, but also the wide differences among the members in population and financial strength. An historical example taken from U.S. history may be useful to make the point. At Philadelphia in 1787, the big states, New York and Virginia, both had very large populations. They argued that representation must be based on population. The states that had small populations, such as Delaware and Rhode Island, argued that representation in Congress must be based on equality of the 13 sovereign states. The Connecticut Compromise solved that problem of legislative representation with a bicameral Congress. Today, the General Assembly does not need a House based on population and a Senate where each member state has the same number of senators. But the General Assembly does need an equitable weighted voting plan that will reflect not only sovereignty and population, but also a state's financial contribution to the UN budget. Weighted voting is used in different forms in all international financial and certain other specialized organizations. In some, it is based on population, and in others, it is based on monetary contributions. The recently adopted Peace-Building Commission is weighted in its representation according to who contributes the money, who contributes the armed forces, as well as other factors. General Assembly decisions utilizing the binding triad would still be made with a single vote, but with 3 simultaneous ways of counting that vote. A computer would instantaneously report whether the resolution had the required majority on each of the 3 legs. The first leg reflects sovereignty. This will give real international power to each of the 192 member states for the first time. It would require 2/3 of the states present and voting. The second leg reflects population. It would require support of nations representing an agreed-upon majority of the world's population. China, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, and other populous states would certainly approve. The third leg reflects financial and military strength. It would also require nations representing the agreed-upon majority of contributions to the UN budget. The US, Japan, and Germany should certainly be pleased. The size of the required majorities on the population leg and on the money leg such as 51% or more, would be negotiated in committee before the plan would be presented to the General Assembly for a final vote. The binding triad would not deprive the General Assembly of its present power to pass non-binding resolutions by the one-member, one-vote system. Likewise, the General Assembly's one-member, one-vote control over the internal affairs of the UN would be retained. The binding triad also provides that no member state would have a vote of more than 15% on either the population or the contribution leg of the triad. On the population leg, China would be limited to 15% despite its having 20% of the world's population. On the monetary leg, the US, which contributes 22%, and Japan, which contributes 19%, would be limited to 15%.
I've been asked to say a word or two about the whole question of charter amendment. There is a history between 1963 and 1965. In fact, the effort was made and the council was expanded from its original 11 members to the current 15. The process, I think, is important to remember. The Security Council doesn't actually vote on this issue. The vote goes to the General Assembly, and if it passes there by the 2/3, then it goes out to the member states where the ratification process takes place. And actually in 1963, when this was tried before, there was a dual resolution in December 63, part for expansion of ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, and part for the expansion of the Security Council. In fact, none of the 5 permanent members at that time voted for both parts of the resolution. But despite that opposition from the 5 permanent members, the resolution swept through the General Assembly. So then the question went to national capitals to see whether, in fact, there would be a ratification of this vote. Then it came really a question of what would the permanent 5 do. The Soviets, recognizing this was in the middle of the Cold War, seeing that they didn't have much to gain by continuing to oppose this, felt to leave it on the Western doorstep. They would go ahead and ratify, and they did. Then it was, of course, a question of China, in that case Taipei, the UK, and France. One after the other, they went along with it, in part because they didn't want to pay the political price of opposing it. And it was a typical case of what we call in political science free riding. They said, let Washington do it. We'll let Washington take the heat. And it was indeed left on Washington's doorstep. At that time, it was the administration of Lyndon Johnson, and where in 1963 they were very caustic and very negative about expanding the council as much as some of these members wanted, and certainly as large an expansion of ECOSOC, they too began to feel the political pressure, and they reevaluated their position. And lo and behold, that same Johnson administration that had been so negative about this in 1963, by the summer of 1965, went before the Senate and said, indeed, this would be good for the UN. It's time to see this change underway. There's no guarantee that this process would work again, but it is instructive, I think.
Your role in weighted voting. What can you do until such time as weighted voting is acted upon by the General Assembly and sent to the 192 member states for ratification by their respective legislatures? We suggest that you bring the message on this DVD to the attention of your secondary schools and universities, to service clubs, and to other non-governmental organizations in your community. Place copies on the shelves of your public and school libraries. Your job will not be done until your local religious and political leaders are aware of the concept of weighted voting. When the time comes to lobby your 2 U.S. senators in Washington or at their offices in your state, the support of those community leaders in person and in their letters that you will carry with you will help make the case for ratification. These non-governmental organizations support the study of weighted voting for the United Nations. Thank you for beginning today your further study of these proposals, which respond to the Secretary General's call for radical reform of the organs of the United Nations, our best hope for world peace and for an effective democratic UN Federation.